everybody, this is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and on this one I'm going to cover the topic of which should you buy, bookshelf speakers or tower speakers. And this is another one of those questions. It comes up a lot. There is so much misinformation out there, it's difficult to even kind of sort through all of it, and I'm going to try to get through each of the things that I think people get wrong around this. So let me start with this. Most manufacturers treat their tower speakers as higher end than their bookshelf speakers within a given line, meaning that the bookshelf is often the cheapest speaker, and then there's either a monitor, which might be like basically a big bookshelf, maybe it has two mid-bass drivers like an MTM, so two mid-basses with a tweeter in the middle. Then there's a small tower often, and then a larger tower, or it might be bookshelf, small tower, larger tower, something like that. So that within a line, you almost always see that the bookshelf speaker and the tower are using common drivers, but the bookshelf is using often just two. It's a two-way design, or maybe it's three and it's a three-way design. And then the tower speaker is maybe 3, 4, or 5-way designs. It's more complicated, right? But let's just take, I'm going to keep using this brand, so I apologize if people don't like it, but I could do this with any brand and it would be the same. I could choose KEF and go through their reference metal line and show you the same thing, but I'm going to use Perlisten because it's a brand that I know really well, again, because I sell, and I really like it. So their bookshelf speaker that's from the top of the line series is called the S4B. It uses a single one of their 7-inch mid-bass drivers connected to their waveguide tweeter array, which has two some people call them mid-ranges. They're basically tweeters too. It's all used for directivity control purposes, but it does give you extra sound energy to work with at the low end, so you can cross it over a little lower and get better directivity matching. So you've got the TechStream mid-bass driver. You've got these TechStream, we'll call them mid-range tweeters, that are on above and below a central beryllium tweeter that operates all the way out to 20, 30 kilohertz. And in this design, what you're getting is good directivity control only from the waveguide. So the woofer, because it's asymmetric, there isn't a woofer above it, cannot be used to do anything to shape the lobe that's coming out of the speaker. So you've probably heard me and others refer to the technology they're using as beamforming. So the two, we'll call them tweeter mid-ranges, that sandwich that middle tweeter and the waveguide combine to reduce vertical directivity. But if you cross over at, let's say, 1.5 kilohertz, you can't control directivity even at the crossover point. Basically, you have to only control the directivity above the crossover point. If you, okay, so now let's go to the monitor, the S5M. That uses one of the 7-inch mid-bass drivers below and one above. So now you can start to control vertical directivity into the range that those mid-bass drivers work. But we've only got one above and below, so we're still limited in what we can do. So there's two problems that will come out of this. And if you look at the vertical dispersion of the S series, you'll see that while it's better than probably any other MTM on the market, it still shows what we refer to as lobing errors as you get more to the extremes off axis. So it's controlling it, but then the response starts to have some issues as you get to the more extreme points. It's not, from a sound quality standpoint, this doesn't really matter that much, but it's a reality. Now, the other thing that happens is that the S4B is their least efficient speaker, and it has the lowest power handling because it's got the least drivers to soak up that power, and it produces the least sound energy, so it's got the lowest output capabilities, and so it's the least dynamic. As you move up to the monitor, that substantially improves. Efficiency goes way up, directivity control goes up. It's more of a realization of the beamforming approach that Perlisten is known for. And it handles more power, and it can produce higher outputs. Everything's good, more dynamic. So now we're getting closer to the ideal that they were looking for. Then we get to the S7T. This scales it up further. It's got another set of mid-bass drivers. Now we get even more sensitivity. We get even more power handling, so the dynamic range is maximized. That speaker will actually do about 120 decibels with that typical 3 dB compression type measurement. That is really loud. The speaker also has the best vertical directivity control. It's the best realization of the beamforming approach. And if you look at the vertical directivity, you'll see it's one of the cleanest that you've ever seen. There's basically, it looks like a pencil, basically, like this very thin beam of perfect energy that comes out the center of those radar plots that we often show to look at this. So much so that some people have misunderstood that to imply that the speaker has really narrow vertical directivity. While it's true that it's controlling it really well, it's not like if you move your head up 5 degrees, the sound goes away, or 10 degrees, the sound goes away. First off, what I've pointed out is at a typical listening distance of 12 feet, you'd have to be standing up on top of a chair to hit the point at which the response has changed substantially. So that's a silly argument to make. A 6 foot tall person standing, let's say, directly behind the listener would hear basically the same thing that the listener would have. And in fact, a lot of speakers that are wide dispersion, their dispersion is so bad off axis, meaning the response changes so much, that person standing would actually get worse sound because of that. So to the point of bookshelves versus towers, as you move up into the larger speakers, you're typically getting more of a realization of what the company intended for that line. So it's usually the top of the line tower is the ultimate expression of what they were trying to achieve. And as a result, the sound quality is better. So the S7T does sound better than the S4B. The S4B, to me, doesn't necessarily sound like a scaled down S7T. It's got the same spectral balance, but there's enough differences that it doesn't sound like the same speaker. At least, right next to each other listening to music or movies. Okay, so then the other thing that comes up a lot that I think is a myth is that smaller rooms should have smaller speakers. There's truth to that and there's not. There are some tower speakers on the market from some brands that are so large, Wilson Audio is a good example of this, that sticking them in a tiny, let's say 10 by 12 room would overwhelm the room in the sense, and I don't mean overwhelm with sound, that actually is not really true. It would overwhelm it in the fact that they perform their best when you're sitting the right distance back from them and when they're the right distance from all the different walls. That room is so small that speaker can't be placed in its ideal location, nor can you be placed in the ideal location to hear them. So they're really too big for a small room. You would want a smaller speaker. However, something like their Sophia speaker, which is a smaller tower, would be fine even in a 10 by 12 room. You wouldn't have issues. You don't need to go to their bookshelf speaker because it's a small room. And the same thing would be true, again, to go with Perlisten. The S7T actually would work fine in a 10 by 12 room. You don't have to go to the S4B because it's a small room. I would say that the reason to go with the S4B over the S7T is going to either be budget or its purpose, like it's being used for surround speakers. If the issue is about size of your room, go with the biggest speaker in that lineup you can afford because it's going to give you better performance even in that small room. And that's because in the case of the Perlisten, it's not a very big tower and it's not so big that smaller rooms put you in a position where they can't be placed ideally in the room, or at least that it's going to be somehow less ideal than the bookshelf. I mean, whatever limitations you would have in this, let's say 10 by 12 room for the S7T, you would also have with the S4B. And so from that standpoint, what I would say is, go with the tower if that makes sense for you budget-wise. Now, the other thing to consider is stands. If you go with a bookshelf, you have to buy stands. So sometimes people will buy the bookshelf, then they buy really cheap, crappy stands. Now, I've heard, for instance, metal stands ring like crazy, and it's audible. I mean, you can really hear it. So you can damp them, but some stands are not designed to be damped or filled with sand or anything, and so you end up with this problem of cheap stands can compromise the performance of the speaker. And I'm not talking about some of that silly stuff where people like get into crazy stands that have decouplers and isolators and magic. I'm just talking about legitimate audible artifacts that happen from the metal ringing because it's not well damped in those stands. Wood actually fixes that. So a cheap stand made of wood tends to sound better than a cheap stand made of metal. Having said that, often, if you're buying like an S4B, that's a really nice speaker. The finish quality is a luxury finish. It's really a beautifully built speaker. So you want a stand that matches the same build and aesthetic, and so those are pretty expensive. If you add the price of the stand and the speaker together, you're right at a pretty similar price point to the S5T. And so at that point, to me, spend the extra money to get the S5T, excuse me, just because the performance is that much better than the S4B with a stand. I probably have this a little off, actually, now I'm saying that to you. It is more expensive, but the point being, you do need to consider it. Maybe the monitor versus the S5M versus the S5T is the better example. The stands actually take you up to a price point where, to me, the tower makes more sense. So the other thing that's advantageous about towers versus bookshelves or even monitors is you can better optimize the enclosure potentially, and it gives you a bit more efficiency in the base. So in the case of the Perlisten stuff, they don't bother to port the S4B. And I think that's smart because in many cases, bookshelf enclosures are too small to port them at a frequency that makes sense. And so you're really better off making them sealed, making sure the drivers have enough power handling and excursion to play as loud as they need to, that they don't need a port for excursion control, and then add a subwoofer, which is how those were designed. The monitor can be used because it's a larger enclosure and ported, but the S5T enclosure is that much larger, and so the performance is better and you get better bass out of it. And that tends to be true of most brands. The larger speakers, the towers versus the bookshelves, even if it's an identical driver array, so even if it was the S4B in a tower enclosure, that larger enclosure would let you then better optimize ports if you're going to have them, or even in the case of a sealed enclosure, just extend the bass that much lower. So my take would be that if sound quality is what you're at, while there's no reason why a bookshelf or a monitor can't be made to sound just as good as a tower, because of the way manufacturers tend to build these speakers, the towers tend to be the better sounding in the lineup versus the bookshelves. If they have a monitor in the lineup, to me that's a better option than the bookshelf if you've got room for it, because they still tend to be better sounding than the bookshelf. And why buy the bookshelf? For me, it's going to be a budget thing or a size thing. Like I just don't have room. Maybe it's an office system for something large like a tower, or I just don't have. I can't afford it. Now, some of you might say, well, what if I can afford the tower from the lineup that's lower, or the bookshelf from the lineup that's higher? What should I do? And that is going to be very brand dependent. So if it's a company like Perlisten, for instance, then I can start to tell you about what things you're losing, again, because I know that line really well. Same with Kef, for instance. Now with Kef, this is what I would say. To go from their reference metal line down to their Q series line, or R series line, the R series is not nearly as good sounding as the reference meta series. It's not like a little step down. It's in price too. It's a substantial step downward. And so to go to the top line tower from the R series versus the Meta bookshelf is a better speaker in almost every way. The only thing it doesn't do as well is bass. So me, I'd buy the reference Meta, but I don't consider those comparable. Perlisten's different actually. Their R series is almost as good as the S series. It's not as big of a step down. It's also not as big of a price step down. And so if I was in a position to get, for instance, the R7T or the S4B, if size is not an issue, I would get the R7T because overall the performance is better. The differences that the S4B would have that make it better than the R7T are going to be that it's just a little tiny bit smoother sounding. It's just a little bit more refined in the high frequencies. It does have a bit lower distortion, but otherwise it's less efficient, it can't play as loud, and it doesn't have as good bass extension. And then in terms of the things they both do well, again, the R7T is going to have the best realization of the beamforming. It's going to have the best vertical directivity. They both are going to have very good horizontal directivity. They both have very smooth responses. And so for me, for my money, if that's my decision, R7T versus S4B, it's going to be the R7T. And that's the kind of the way you need to look at it with most speaker brands. When you look at the step down to get a bigger speaker, is the step down series a little bit worse than the step up series? And then you can get a much better speaker for the money that way? Or is it substantially worse? And so if it really is substantially worse, and substantially worse doesn't mean bad. It just means like maybe one is like one of the best speakers on the market and the other is very good for the money. It's just not in that same echelon of quality. Then I wouldn't go down to that, if I was looking for that higher performance. So in the case of Perlisten, I would do a step down if I needed to get the better speaker. In the case of Kef, I wouldn't do that. I would stick to the better speakers. And that would be true, I think, for a number of other brands, where I don't feel like the step down is good enough to merit going with the top of the line of that series versus the bottom of the line of the higher series. So hopefully, again, this video is helpful and that you find this informative. Subscribe for more videos, and thanks for watching.